Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good afternoon, everybody. So let's resume our work. And so now we're going to focus on building the future in the light of the past. And we're going to look at the social, economic, political, and educational value of cultural heritage. This is a roundtable to which we've invited 5 guest speakers. And all of the presentations will be provided both in French and in English. I am moderating in French, but I will switch to English from time to time. And by way of introduction, I wanted to mention a few items. You know, we're talking about heritage issues, and we're trying to question what constitutes the different types of heritage assets, industrial, scientific, cultural. Therefore, our various speakers are going to offer up various approaches, be it from a disciplinary standpoint, a time scale, a spatial and time scale. And thanks to the research, we're going to have a better understanding of the value that is attributed by various social actors to the different heritage values that we're going to see this afternoon. So I'll be introducing each speaker in turn, and I'll invite them to come up and start their presentation. So just 10 minutes. It's very important for us to respect this 10-minute moment so that people who are listening to us online or people who are here in person can ask questions or can provide commentary if they so wish to do. We're going to start off with Alain Blayot. And Alain, I'd like to invite you to perhaps go up to the podium while I introduce you. Alain Blayot focuses on the transmissibility of intangible cultural assets, particularly in the area of fishing. He's found in UTERP, which focuses on different types of projects, such as self-employment, ecotourism. So thank you to Alain Blayot for joining us today. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank those who have invited me to come here today. And I'd also like to thank those who are attending today's session. This is important to me because this means I can talk about something that's not very spoken about much. So the Prud'homies in the Mediterranean. Prud'homies are fishing collectives in the Mediterranean. And thanks to those who came today, because this morning I heard all sorts of vocabulary words, and I have all sorts of questions that came to mind that I would have never thought of on my own. So thank you to Mr. Christian Eller, who said we need to have more utopian approaches. So what we're going to talk about today is a utopia that is about 700 years old. And this is about fishermen who believed in and who decided to build an equalitarian society, and we'll see how. I'd also like to thank the chair of the sciences who talked about the Science Foundation, who talked about human rights, and we're going to talk about that as well. And so this is an ICH, an immaterial, intangible cultural heritage that those who have created don't like to hear us talk about a lot. So let me tell you about what I mean by fishing in the Mediterranean, what are Prud'homies, the fishing collectives, and what might be their future, regardless of what you think of them. So can somebody help me out with changing the slides? Thank you. So can these Prud'homies represent a model for the economy of tomorrow, from poaching to the Nobel Prize? Because fishing out at sea is not something that's regulated. Anybody can go out on a boat and go fishing, except if you want to sell what you've caught. But fishing in itself as an activity is not regulated. So anything that's not regulated in France is referred to as poaching, braconnage, poaching. Conversely, there is somebody called Alina Estrom who has worked on fishing economies, and this person received the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Economy Prize, in some years ago, and I will talk about that in a few moments. So now that I've given you the general context, next slide, please. So let me just pass on to the next slide. So this is the background, the Mediterranean Sea, beautiful. This is where people come spend their vacations. But there are very few fish in this sea. The Mediterranean Sea, in fact, has remarkable biodiversity that is recognized by scientists worldwide. But compared to the Atlantic Sea, the Mediterranean does not have many fishing resources. And so the fishermen there have to work on a scarce fishing resource, but which is sufficient to feed local populations. Therefore, it requires very diverse and specific know-how, because it needs to be what I call a selective fishing. Fishing is conducted species by species, and every time a species of fish, a different technique needs to be used. You don't use the same technique to fish sardines or tuna or other types of fish. So a fisher who fishes in the Mediterranean works on a boat in which there are rarely 2 people. 3 people would be a large crew. Often these fishermen work alone, and they apply different techniques and there are regulations in terms of the location in which they apply their methods, but also in terms of where they set off from. You can't fish the same species on the same day. It's going to be sardine on day 1 and a different type of fish on a different one. And here I'm mentioning different types of fish, but I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that it's really regulated by species. So these fishermen have an immense knowledge of the fishing resources. This is an ancestral know-how. It's passed down from father to son. And it also entails knowing how to recognize the behavioral characteristic of each fish species. It's like being a hunter. You need to be able to position yourself accurately and able to catch the fish. But you also need to understand the reproduction cycles of this resource. Because if you fish all of the fish of a certain size from a certain species, well, a few months later, that resource will be depleted because the species will not have had time to reproduce. Therefore, it's very important to strike the right balance between the amount of fish that you catch and the number of species present. And so this is something that these fishermen are aware of. You also have to have intuitive ethology knowledge and understand the environments. The Mediterranean coastline is no longer a wild coastline. It's completely artificial, and you have to understand how these wild species are going to react to man-made coastline structures. So let's talk about the fishermen. Fishermen do not divulge where they go fishing. That's a closely guarded secret. But you do need to transfer that knowledge. For example, if you work with a young person who wants to learn how to fish, then that's going to be a knowledge that is transmitted without it being spoken. It's going to be based on experience. So the small pace, the space in which fish are fished, is very important. And the types of fish species that are going to be caught by the various fishermen, these are territorial fish. So these are not migratory fish. They don't go very far. And if they go astray 1 kilometer away, they normally reside. That's quite rare because, as I said, these are territorial fish. And this is an important thing to note because there's a lot of competition. It's very tough competition because all of the fishermen, of course, want to go fish in the same area. And so they try to find the perfect area in which to fish. It's going to be a promising area thanks to the currents and thanks to the presence of a lot of fish. And there are also other actors along the coastline. For example, people who have fishing boats, but these are sports fishermen, sports anglers. And this is another complication for fishermen, as well as the difficulty posed by coastal developers. Because when there is coastal development, sometimes this can scare away the fish. Let me try to. So in order to organize all this, the fishermen have invented what is known as a prud'homme. And it's in 2025 that we, for the first prud'homme, so it's a regulation set up by a community of fishermen in the city of Marseille. And so they decided from henceforth, we're going to fish and catch a certain species from this date to that date, and then the next species from another date to another date. And the fishermen served on these fishing tribunals. They were the regulators, but they were also the predators. They were also fishing the fish as well as regulating how it's fished. And so they played all roles at once, which is why I refer to this as a utopian concept. Therefore, they have what I would call a civic knowledge, a certain level of civic knowledge. Today, what is a prud'homme? Because they still exist today. A prud'homme today is a sovereign community on a given territory that is delimited by the state. So, for example, there are 33 prud'hommes along the coastline of France and Corsica. And so they've divided up the territories. And each area is the size of 1 or 2, sometimes 3 communal areas. And in these specific areas, there are certain fish species that inhabit these areas. So it's been divvied up. And this is a privileged area from a terrestrial standpoint. And there are various regulations, thus, that are provided by the fishing prud'homme, the fishing collective. So the prud'hommes are the fishermen themselves. They are they are boat owners who have practiced their profession for 1 year at least, and they have been elected to their position by their peers. So if you speak to a fisherman in the Mediterranean, if he's a bit aged, of a certain age, he will tell you that he was a prud'homme. He was a member. Because that means at some point in time, he agreed to play the role of policing this whole fishing collective. So it's a 3-year mandate, and every 3 years, new prud'hommes are elected. And so there is a renewal that takes place within the community. And this is a system that continues to work very well today, but it is something that is hidden from sight, mainly for political reasons. May we ask you to wrap up because we are running out of time. So, my conclusion in 2 words. Here, this is an institution that has a regulatory and judicial level. Indeed, it regulates the management of fishing in a given area, and due to this, it has led to economic consequences. So if a prud'homme is able to ensure, prud'hommes have been able to ensure that fishing resources are sustainable, therefore it has an economic impact. And this is in contradiction, should I say, with the way industrial fishing works, because industrial fishing fishes everything that it needs, and even more than that. It goes beyond necessity. It goes beyond that which is enough in a given territory. So industrial fishing has a very predatory dimension. And we talk a lot about overfishing nowadays. And that's why it's very important to continue to have prud'hommes. Prud'hommes prevent overfishing because prud'hommes regulate the act of fishing in its say. So this goes from the judicial level to the economic level. I touched upon it very briefly. And so now I'm going to go straight to my conclusion. Unfortunately, I don't have time to present everything that I wanted to. But if you want to look at this, you can go to an internet site that explains it all in great detail. And here it is. I would like to refer you to culturemaire.net. And you can go to this website to understand everything. And it has an interactive map that is available to the prud'hommes, to the fishermen who are members of the prud'hommes. And so it's very important to understand these various locations. And so you can click on any coat of armors. These coat of armors match up with a specific prud'homme. And so you'll be able to find out more about these protected maritime areas. This is the method that we've chosen to talk about this immaterial cultural heritage that is very discreet because they don't want to be spoken of very much. Either they're afraid that they'll end up in a museum or they're afraid that they'll come into direct confrontation with industrial fishing, and that is a confrontation that they wish to avoid. So I hope I've completed on time. You have. Thank you so much. Thank you. Looks like you had a very long presentation. I apologize. I hope that we didn't interrupt you, and I hope that through the questions later on we can go into greater detail on this very interesting topic that you have been presenting today. So the next speaker today, and I'd like to invite this person to come up, Thor.
Il est historien, il travaille sur un certain nombre de méthodes issues de domaines interdisciplinaires.
Working in interdisciplinary field of studies in terror and memory, working with families, victims of the terrorist attacks, and working on the terrorist attack in 2011 in Norway. Thank you very much for being with us.
Before COVID, before Ukraine, but also before the terror attacks in Norway, in Oslo and at Utøya that killed 77 people, many of them young, many of them children. Before July 22nd, 2011, Norway was known as one of the most peaceful countries in the world. The brutality and the scale of the attacks shocked Norway and it shocked the world. The attacks came not from the outside. It came from within, from a Norwegian right-wing extremist and anti-immigrant fanatic who believed that Norway had been betrayed by all political parties and especially by the Labour government who had allowed Muslims into Norway. The attacks came in two parts. First, with a 950-kilo fertilizer bomb placed in front of the main building of the government center in Oslo. 8 people were killed and large part of the government complex destroyed. The main target, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, then Prime Minister of Norway, now General Secretary of NATO, survived. Thereafter, the terrorists traveled to the tiny island of Utøya, 1 hour drive from Oslo, where he shot and murdered 69 young people at the Labour Youth Party summer camp. As a memorial historian, I was asked by the government and the victim organizations to help put together an international team to work on a roadmap for a memorial process, both at Utøya and in Oslo. In processes like this, there are questions that needs to be asked and questions that needs to be answered. How do we remember? What do we remember? Where do we remember? Why do we remember? And who is to decide? This is about dialogue, it's about negotiations. In often raises edge issues, we struggled for several years on how to balance the different needs for remembering, for learning, but also for the need to rebuild and to create spaces for new life and new memories. 10 years have passed. We have made a lot of mistakes, but we have also learned a lot. We have learned about dilemmas and choices, and we have learned that the processes are just as important as the results. International cooperation has been at the core of our work from the start. We have learned, for example, from those who had worked in Oklahoma City after the terror bombing in 1995, and from those who worked at 9/11 in New York after 2001. And in the picture, you see a French delegation visiting Utøya in 2019. We don't believe in fixed answers, but we do believe that there are some principles, or at least some focal points, that needs to be addressed. It's about giving priority to the victims, about learning from others, about the power of place, and about balancing both memory and the need for new life. Here you see the government center in Oslo at the day of the terror. Here you see Utøya, this tiny Labour Youth Party island. This is the day before, and one day later, this paradise is turned into a nightmare. A key issue at Utøya was the cafe building, a large building located in the middle of the island. 13 teenagers were murdered in the building, and many believed that the dark history of the building would make it impossible for the Labour youth to return to the island. The building, therefore, they argued, needed to be torn down. Others argued that the cafe building now had become a sacred space and that it should be preserved as is, as a site of commemoration. But slowly, finding our way into a compromise, we were able to remove most part of the building, but still preserving all the building elements directly affected by the terror. As part of the concept, the remains of the building became surrounded and protected by a new building structure, thereby also adding new spaces for memory. By transforming the cafe building into Heinhuset, a memorial and learning center, all groups were eventually able to move forward. In 2015, the camps could start again. And Utøya is today visited by thousands of young people from different organizations from all over Europe who come to learn about dialogue and democracy and the impact of violence. The Labour Youth Party gradually realized that Utøya, their island, had become more important after the dark day in 2011 than it was before. Partly because the need to remember those who are no longer among us, but also for all of us today, as a reminder of what's at stake in Europe. This picture is from 2016, where we opened an exhibition showing text messages going back and forth to the island during the attacks. The young people at Utøya know that we cannot take democracy for granted. They paid a dear price 10 years ago, learning that there are always some that want something else. These young people know that democracy do not come cheaply, that we must fight it every day, and that we need places and spaces like Utøya that reminds us of what's at stake. This is Oslo at the opening of the July 22nd Center, a twin project based on the same principles we worked on at Utøya. This was the first public space in Norway, open for all to learn about what happened, and it has also become the Norway Now, a place to remind us why we in Norway now must rebuild our whole government center. We're back at Utøya. This is one of my favorite photos. Here you see the former cafe building, now Heinhuset. Inside, there are 69 pillars, carrying the roof, one for each victim. The outer wall consists of 465 pillars, one for each survivor, protecting the victims. And outside and in front, we see new generations of young people coming to the island, protecting memory, protecting each other, protecting democracy. This is my last slide. No other country in Western Europe has suffered as much from terrorism as France over the past 10 years. During more than 50 attacks, 300 people have been killed, including dozens of children and teenagers. In 2018, President Macron called for the creation of a memorial museum of terrorism. Now, France has started the work on a museum that will trace the development of terrorism over the ages, including the Bataclan concert hall and others. The museum is planned to open in the Paris area sometime by 2027. And it will address how France and other terror-affected countries have related to the attacks, with a particular emphasis on the resilience of their people. I was trying to go back one slide. Could anyone help me? There. Thank you. Finally, here on the last picture, you saw the French task force started their work in 2019 by visiting Utøya and the July 22nd Center in Oslo. Since then, we have stayed in contact and we're now developing a roadmap for future cooperation. In fact, we're going to meet there in Paris on Thursday. So, finally, Norway is not France. Utøya is not Paris. Dark forces come in all shapes and forms. But still, there are some principles that we share. We need to tell what happened, and we need to tell it where it happened. Some are always more affected than others. We need to take care of the inner circle first. We need to learn from others. This is work in progress with no fixed solutions. We need to balance memory and new life. We need both. And we need to bear in mind that democracy cannot be taken for granted. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot for this fascinating paper. The paper and maybe a link between those papers is the relationship between memories and heritage. So it could be a point during the discussion. Notre prochain invité.
Our next invited speaker, Carlo Guadagno. I'll ask him to come up to the rostrum. He is an independent researcher and climate change activist, looking at various dimensions, culture, geography, climate change, and working on the studies of various European cities using a multidisciplinary approach, cultural approach, and working specifically on alternatives to the growth paradigm, specifically implications for tourism, in globalization, commercialization, and the expansion of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you. My presentation will be in English. But before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing such an important event on an important topic such as cultural heritage. I'd also like to thank the International Commission for selecting me as a speaker here. I represent the next generations, and it gives us hope to see that there's room for us as well in this discussion.
heritage in the 21st century, driven towards what? I'm trying now to use this, okay. I will not present to you any specific case study, but I will try to bring to the table more a wide discussion on the cultural heritage itself, critical discussion. And so I divided the presentation in four main parts, as you can see. So let's start with the first one. Okay, legacy, shaping the present and defining the future. What we mean by heritage and cultural heritage has continually changed through time, following a process of concept boundaries enlargement, extending their overall meaning and consideration within society. This process must be critically analyzed to avoid misunderstandings, instrumentations, or manipulations over the cultural heritage. Empirical research shows that no expert, group, or coalition can define alone, from a privileged position of power, what heritage, culture, or cultural heritage is within a group or society. This recalls the power imbalances between those who do and do not possess the authority necessary to shape the heritage discourse. To this regard, Smith talks of authorized heritage discourse as a dominant Western attitude towards heritage, based on a top-down discourse that defines who the legitimate spokespersons for the past are, shaping heritage management overall. International culture, international forces. In the 20th century, the post-war stimulated the formation of a movement contributing to the extension of what previously considered as cultural heritage, by including vast portions of territories, their landscapes, practices, representations, traditions, know-how, and polarizing the discourse in two main spheres, tangible and intangible heritage, while for many scholars, they represent two faces of the same coin. Cameroon, for instance, is particularly critical toward the implementation of international cultural conventions, noticing that they essay to reach international approvals for what to remember and what to forget. For Hewison, the so-called heritage industry is destroying an authentic version of the past and replacing it with simulacra of that past. There is empirical evidence, indeed, that international initiatives are often more acts of neglecting than acts of including, that risk to weaken the comprehensive knowledge of the heritage itself and generate disputes, if not hostilities. Heritage, values, and visions. The idea of heritage is grounded on the existence of a value, to be preserved and passed to future generations. The heritage attains this status by attributing to it social, religious, cultural, economic, or any kind of value that proclaims somehow its right to preservation. With such proliferation of definitions and approaches, cultural heritage is not uniquely perceived as valuable in itself, but also framed as an essential driver of change and development. As such, it gains a renewed consideration worldwide as a crucial territorial asset, shaping policies that go beyond the heritage itself. This vision of understanding heritage as a value, as well as a system for finding and producing values, has greater consequences than previous conceptualization and practices, affecting how cultural heritage is shaped from one side and how it shapes its places from another. This is particularly true in continents like Europe, where cultural heritage already represents a strong economic asset and power tool. Cultural heritage, tourism, and capitalism. Many recent transformation processes of the cultural heritage present and reinvent the heritage as a product of consumption, similar to a fossil wealth, manageable and exploitable as the petroleum, as noticed by Jacques Rigaud. These are also the resultants of new conceptualization of heritage and of the greater awareness of the potential, namely political and economic, at the base of its patrimonialization. This is significant, especially considering the transformative power of the travel industry. The relationship between tourism and heritage has presumably never been so problematic before. And the worldwide affirmation of mass tourism paradigms challenges a beneficial relationship among the two. If they can be allies for better heritage exploitation and richer tourism experiences, the risk of losing the boundaries between processes of using and methods of abusing the cultural heritage is actual and worrying. This use-abuse dichotomy is critically important since risks of mystification or alteration of cultural heritage and this narrative are a reality, and consequences are often out of control. Culture can be a major economic driver and an empowering asset for places and societies. However, we have to recognize how challenging it is. Affirming the economic centrality of the cultural heritage can prejudice its cultural and social values. For instance, by accepting interventions that reduce, reinvent, or mystify it to have a more attractive or even more sellable heritage. That's why it's important to consider heritage as a process, as did by Smith, focusing on allowing organicity towards heritage development and management instead of imposing artificiality, and prioritizing endogenous over exogenous development. While achieving economic objectives, we cannot forget that heritage is also and foremost a pillar of the social function, emerging and existing as a space for coexistence and confrontation, where social complicity and common values are expressed and manifest as a central constituent of the identity. Concluding, I stressed how articulated the cultural heritage is and how intricate is the way towards its proper management and exploitation. In an era in which everything is endangered by indistinct processes of commodification, cultural heritage needs to find solid ground on which to stand. This context requires the awareness that while confronting heritage, individualistic interests and initiatives cannot prevail over the fundamental communitarian and universal instances of which the cultural heritage is constituted, and that grant its extraordinary value and significance. Cultural actors must focus on recognizing cultural complexities and interlinkages to promote their continuous affirmation and renewal, avoiding conflicts and ensuring that no one is excluded from this fundamental democratic process of auto-definition and auto-determination. Finally, when a community is powerless in the process of taking care of its heritage, it's inevitably vulnerable and dependent on external factors and subjects. Efforts for more inclusive practices led to developing community-based heritage initiatives. However, they are still particularly powerless and fragile in shaping heritage policies and practices. And this is indispensable to attain what envisioned by the Faro Convention in 2005. Everyone, alone or collectively, has the right to benefit from the cultural heritage and to contribute toward its enrichment. Some sources. Je termine. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour votre...
Thank you very much for your presentation, which really introduces various dimensions at scale, the various levels that need to be mobilized so that we can preserve our cultural heritage. And perhaps we can discuss this a bit more at length later on. And our next speaker, Stefan Olivesi, I'd like to thank him for joining us today. He's going to discuss the local level. Stefan Olivesi is a professor at the Université Saint-Quentin, Paris-Saclay Université, and he co-directs a seminar that talks about heritage and patrimonialization that was published last year. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Francois. In fact, I'm going to be the bad student here because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation there for you. Oh, thank you for to the person clapping there. I was hoping to make somebody out there happy. Okay, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'm going to give you a reference for anyone who wants to read up on what I'm going to talk to you about. There's an article that's going to be coming out in a review soon. Quebec, it's Quebec. It's in Quebec. It's number 39. The Québécois. It's an article that says, title, Forgetting Patrimony, or Forgetting Heritage. That's maybe personal and intimate. I'm a bit uncomfortable talking to you about this today in public. I would really rather have us all be sitting around a table. That would be easier for me, because it's a matter of myself in the article, where I used myself as a sort of tool to reflect on the questions of heritage and patrimonialization. Now, just a moment ago, he said that I was heading up a seminar, a symposium that is going to be addressing the issues of patrimonialization. We tried to come up with something original, eschewing traditional approaches, stressing the space of the actor or the stakeholder, almost the economic dimension of patrimonial heritage issues, and commercially speaking, in a symbolic economy, if you will, where the stakeholders will be mobilizing heritage, creating heritage to produce resources to then develop a business and economic activity, but also to enhance their culture and so on, and their identities. So with this analysis prism, from this vantage point, I address the topic I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, it's the relationship to heritage that locals in a small village in Southern Europe, where I've come from, this is their viewpoint that they could have. Now, the starting point of my reflection is very simple. It's when I was on vacation, I was on holiday in this village, my hometown, last summer. My father was born there, so every year I go there and I encounter things that move me, that remind me, and that I feel close to, and that are related to historic issues. But the inhabitants that I encounter, that I know, that I frequent, they don't really feel, they can't really identify with those issues. I tried to figure out why myself, why I was moved by these points, and why the locals were not. So abstractly, just a couple of things. The village where I come from is close to another village. It's called Solekaru, and Solekaru, John Boswell, from the 18th century. It was recommended by Rousseau, and they meet Noemi. And so I go through the village on Sunday. I think about Pauli, I think about Rousseau, I think about all these things that happen. And these things are not materialized in the place. There's nothing concrete there. And they're not even in local people's memories. They're atypical like myself, who are not really local anymore. Okay, some people know the history a bit because they took interest in it, but the history isn't inscribed in the place. It's not the history that most of the locals have taken ownership of. It got me thinking as to why locally the inhabitants didn't want to spotlight that heritage. There's Pauli, there are others. There are things like in Listriac and Mérimée, and the first census taking, and the chateau is there, the castle. And I asked a cousin, I said, where are the castles? And he laughed at me, saying, oh, don't over there and get lost in the maquis, because we'll send the police to look for you. So there's this sort of negation of the heritage. So what I wanted to do was sort of turn this perspective around, and starting with heritage that's established, rather than starting with heritage that's established, with, say, a lack of knowledge, or little known, or maybe forgotten, or maybe mutation of elements, of these heritage elements that perhaps have no value for anybody else other than me, but I think that they do, and in my eyes they do, but for the locals, these points aren't of any interest or of any value to them. Thinking about what Pauli said, that's an example of, say, the Istria Chateau, the castle visited by Prosper Mérimée, and there are other examples like that. There's the pathways, the routes of Mérimée, and there's just the local culture that's very rich there as well, and I'll come back to that, and that might be the conclusion of my talk, which is a sort of offsetting what I'm going to say here. So the study I carried out was sort of reversing the viewpoint, and rather than a patrimonialization process, it was a sort of non-patrimonialization process. So the scheme that I used is nothing particularly original. It was just looking at the domination chain, not the massive type that, but it's because that's something that annoys me to no end when I sometimes read like these domination chains that are theoretically a bit heavy. But what's important is destructuring the nomination, destructuring the nomenclature of this. It can be interesting for individuals based on their viewpoint, but or not. So an illustration to understand this. For instance, when I was a child, I remember a place that I considered poor in terms of from an eternity standpoint, where there are lots of areas in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the village that had farming resources. We produced a lot of things, and it was exported. So it wasn't economically poor. But my conditioned viewpoint made me perceive the territory as being poor, the land being poor. Where the village where I said Paoli or Rousseau, Paoli would come and sojourn there. So in my childhood, people would come and they would stand in line at the fountain to get some water. So I kept the perception of a very poor village, but it wasn't like we were in the 18th century and we had to stand in line. So I just want to help you understand I'm working on this chain of domination and how you can internalize something like that, which I did through my perception I had as a child. Now, I did three things. It's very intimate, as I said. So I worked on the bases that are related to my family resources, and I tried to describe my family history to a certain extent. It was the way I experienced it anyway, through my relationships, my grandfather, great uncles, aunts, and so on and so forth. Keeping in mind that, like a lot of families, nothing really original here, when you look at families, if you look at the Corsica families, a lot of the families left Corsica for economic reasons, for ideological reasons. There were divisions in the families between those who stayed in the homeland and those who left Corsica. So looking at some of the maybe hypothetical explanations, so this sort of lack of cultural heritage here, there's some family intimate history related to the economic situation. And there were some people who left Corsica, and there were some who stayed, turned their back on the past, as it were, or suppressed it, and some who stayed. In fact, the land that they stayed on, in fact, was a land that was worthless. So they had to, they had the inheritance, they had the heritage there, but they didn't inherit of the wine-growing regions from Bordeaux. But it's a bit similar, and so you can understand the connection that the locals had to the places. So the first type of explanation there is maybe in the family divisions and opposition from the opposition of those who stayed and those who left. So it's the Corsican identity that they still have, but the others have it perhaps a bit deeper. It goes much further than what I'm saying here, but there's social rights and sometimes wanting there's the accountability, and there's a rejecting that responsibility. So as you analyze that and try and retranscribe that, sort of like a holographer would do, but there's what I experienced in my childhood, and then there's another type of source that are much more contemporary interactions through my relations with the locals in the village. I didn't carry out any interviews because that format, I think, would have been a bit complicated, and trying to explain that in my article. It's not that people would have misunderstood. It's just the interactions and exchanges that might produce elements that would edify my thinking about the current relationship with the place and the populations I talked about in the article, the family relations. These are not the populations that live in the village now. Okay, there's been a shift there because there's been immigration, emigration, both of these processes, and there's an aging population and so on and so forth. Spare you the details, but then there's a third source that I used, and these were sort of interviews with a stakeholder that is the complete opposite of my demonstration, that perhaps does identify heritage. I'm not the only crazy person saying that there might be some items here that have a cultural heritage. And so there's a family, and there's one stakeholder in the family in wine growing, and he was able to spotlight validate his heritage, the heritage value of the terroir of the lands. And look at Francois. I know I need to speed up. Okay, I need a few seconds to wrap this up. Their cultural heritage, their patrimonialization strategies that are carried by economic stakeholders. I'm not talking about those, but and then their patrimonialization strategies that are carried out by other stakeholders. So these that I'm referring to, this person inherited a conservatory from his father in the 60s, 70s. His father was an agricultural engineer, and most of the farm there was eradicated, but then there was a conservatory. And so what they did was they started producing these grapevines and now are selling wine at a relatively high price, so high value here, which is intrinsically connected to the heritage value of the vines that he's using. So they're very rare vines. If you know that there are trends in wine, and you have to have rare grape varieties, and this is a very rare grape variety. So he was able to transform this conservatory into a driver to produce value in in this wine, and his father did the same thing with Laughing Cow. So, as a simple illustration here, this is just to show you that there are stakeholders, there are actors there that can take value, take ownership of their heritage, their land, and make it valuable. So by thinking then, led me to why did these few stakeholders, why did these people take this heritage that exists, and how did they know how to turn it into something valuable? How did they decide to leverage that? And why did these others that I started talking about in the beginning, why did they not? And this brings me back and it'll bring me to my conclusion. I'm going to try and illustrate the relationships that took place, connections to memory, and investment as well, and the ability to spotlight heritage based on the resources available to the various individuals. Now, if you're interested in reading the article, you'll have to be patient. It's not available yet. It's not online yet, but it will be soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, which 10 minutes, I know it's just too short for all of these really brilliant presentations. So thank you to all of you for keeping to the 10 minutes. So we're going to wrap up this roundtable with our last speaker, Zoe Tsirzoni. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. She is a researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research at CNRS at the Joint Laboratory Archaeology and Antiquity Sciences of the Antiquity, so the Bronze Age and the Neolithic era in various regions of the Mediterranean. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Greetings. Please bear with me while I sort out my presentation. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very glad, very happy to be here today in this very exciting conference, and to this roundtable in particular, who is dealing with the question of the definition, indeed, of cultural heritage and the way we share this cultural heritage, or we present this cultural heritage to the public. In my presentation, which I prepared together with a Greek colleague from the Greek Ministry of Culture, Dimitra Malamidou, we are dealing about the question of the way to present prehistoric vestiges, prehistoric remains in general, and in particular in countries that are heavily affected by the antique past, which is the case of Greece, among others. No. Okay. I have a problem with the slides. Oh, okay. It's a little bit slow. So our case study is taken from a prehistoric site. When I say prehistoric site, it's not a Paleolithic cave, but rather a proto-historic site, Neolithic and Bronze Age mainly, which stands in the northeastern part of present-day Greece. Its name is Dikilitage, and it is very well known to the scientific community as it is one of the biggest tell settlements in Southeast Europe, with one of the longest sequences of occupation, over 8,000 years of occupation, of human presence, and a long, very long period of investigation in collaboration, international collaboration between Greek and French teams especially, but also other institutions. Recently, the archaeological mission of Dikilitage has been awarded with a great prize of archaeology of the Institut de France, Fondation del Duca, and this gives an idea of the importance of the site. I will not present, of course, the record thoroughly here, just some highlights, some of the major results that make this site important. One of the earliest so far settlements in Europe, the earliest in its broader area, which renewed the debate about the start of Neolithic life in Southeast Europe, with very important architectural remains and a lot of attractive, so to say, finds, surprising innovations, among which the earliest evidence of wine production in Europe, and many others, and also, last but not least, the studies since several years now of the relation of past populations with natural environment in the long term, and the evidence of an important resilience of these prehistoric populations in times of rapid climate change. Dikilitage is a great site, but we have to be aware that it is not, it's not at all times, it is part of networks of sites. Here I show a map and pictures showing how similar sites existed with similar material culture existed in other parts of the Balkans in the 5th millennium BC. So this is the regional and super-regional scale, and at a different scale, at the local scale, décolletage has the chance, the privilege, to stand at only 2 kilometers from another very important archaeological site that many of you probably know, which is the site of Philippi, recently inscribed in the list of World Cultural Heritage of UNESCO, and which is one of the most visited sites in northern Greece. Now, the question we are asking ourselves as directors of this ambitious and very important archaeological research program is how to share with the public the results, the wealth, the importance of this fantastic site, knowing, of course, that there is not one public, but many publics. There is not one thing to show, but many. And what all the decisions that we make do not concern only the present day, but also the future, and have to be as much as possible sustainable and adaptable. In our projects, let's say, for the presentation of décolletage to the public, which focuses, of course, to the prehistoric period, as I said, we wish to put forward 3 aspects that I put here on the slide, which is the non-national character of the achievements of prehistoric populations. As I said, we are in a country which is very strongly, very much proud, justly, but maybe a little bit too much of their antique past, the monumental antique past, and which is, and the prehistoric achievements are quite different in nature and scale. The second element that we wish to put forward is the strong connection of this settlement with the natural environment, knowing that some parts of this natural environment are completely lost today or threatened, forests, for example, or swamps. And third, the atemporal, I don't know if the term is correct, but the character of the some of the solutions adopted by prehistoric people, and which could be very useful sources of inspiration today for modern builders, artists, and modern people in general. Our actions already done or planned are developed on 2 scales, 2 geographical scales, long distance and short distance on-spot actions. Since 10 years now, we have created a specific website dedicated to the site, which since the beginning was opened on 3 languages, French and English, but also Greek. And it is important, we believe, to communicate also with, indeed, the local people in their own language and not through English. This site is actually very successful. We receive thousands of connections every year, and 1/3 of them, of these connections, are indeed from Greece. So it's a powerful tool of communication and diffusion of the knowledge. We would be very happy in the future to have more sites like this one, more websites in other sites of Europe, because, as I said, décolletage has cousins and brothers and sisters in many parts of Europe, but who do not have websites like that. And our ambition, our project could be one day to create a network of such websites in order to show indeed this cultural heritage, which is not very easy to present on the spot, but it is very, let's say, much easier to show through documents, through digital presentations, and oppose in this way our similarities, our connecting points as European citizens against the present frontiers, a very actual theme, in fact. And in doing so, we would like to put forward also the richness of national languages, because our ambition would be, in the frame of this tool, to develop, to have the possibility to have full text search inside these websites in the different national languages, and so facilitate the exploitation of research results for educational purposes. On the spot, we are preparing to open the site to the visitors. It is not the case now. It seems that the most obvious action, but actually it's the most long-term and difficult action, in fact. And of course, we are quite concerned about how to develop our project, considering the proximity with the Philippi, the big archaeological site of Philippi. We would like to profit from the proximity, but also create a proper dynamic, and also inscribe the site in the natural environment and contribute to preserve and enhance the latter. These are some of the projects we have for the near future, I hope, about the arrangement of the site, create paths connecting the site with the natural environment, and also allowing to stroll around the tell. Actually, it is very exciting when you walk up a tell site, because it's like a time machine. Every step you move higher brings you a few centuries forward, and this is something very interesting to see and feel on the place. Our architectural remains, as you see, are less monumental than the theater of Philippi or the Basilica, but it is very important to show them as well, and we plan to create a protective dome about these houses to allow visitors to view them. Also a sector in the summit of the tell with late Bronze Age remains and late Byzantine remains, which is also an opportunity to show the spatial proximity, the stratigraphical proximity of these remains. Construction of non-site museum with replicas, with reconstructions of Neolithic houses, and presentation of some of the objects in there as parts of true households, not in showcases. And also an area reserved for experimental archaeology, which is an approach, methodological approach, currently very much used in archaeology, especially in prehistoric archaeology, which allows to not copy ancient realizations and ancient objects or houses, but also understand, reproduce the gestures and the materials, and even understand the feelings that are the senses behind these activities. So these are some of the ideas that we have for the near future.
Unfortunately, it is time for conclusion, because we need to keep time for the debates, please.
And I thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. C'est vraiment très frustrant. Merci d'avoir respecté la règle du jeu.
Thank you all for keeping with your time. I'm looking at the organizers. We're going to run over a bit, if it's okay. Take about 10 minutes of questions. We're about out of time. But we had 5 very different talks that were complementary. And I suggest that we have a very quick discussion with our guests. So handing the floor over to you.
Et on me glisse à l'oreille qu'il peut aussi y avoir des discussions informelles.
Okay, I'm told that we can also have informal discussion after our session here. So any questions in the room here in the audience?
Alors, je vais ouvrir le débat.
All right, let me start the discussion. All the presentations were very different regarding the objects, the approaches, the disciplines. So it's not simple to tie these together. But I think that all of you are interested in a certain number of, say, social actors working, struggling, fighting, advocating, trying to raise awareness to a certain type of heritage. So I'd like to hear what you think about what distinguishes your approaches. Sometimes on a scale, sometimes it's a local scale, a global scale, and you've got all of these scales in between. So with the social actors taking ownership of, whether they're linked together or not. So I'd like to hear you on that, and maybe more specifically for some of the talks on the European scope of it to raise awareness to the value of the heritage that you're working on.
Proposer une...
Okay, who would like to get started here?
This has been very. What struck me was that there's a spectrum here from the theoretical, reflective level to the much more hands-on project, and I think this is more a general comment, but it's an important comment. I think that we definitely need both, and the interplay between theoretical reflections and hands-on concrete practical projects is one of the things that distinguishes cultural heritage and critical heritage as a science or an interdisciplinary field of work. So that's I think I'll stop there, but I think that's always been thinking about that as one of the characteristics of this field, and this panel clearly showed it. So.
Yeah, true. Thank you. Carlo, yes, please. Okay, thank you.
We try to face it in an international way. It's true that we have this positive side of making it universal from our sides, but at the same time, I think that we are disconnecting it from the local. So at the same time, I think that we should always try to live the cultural heritage, the culture in general, locally, and then have a support international side. But many times there is an imposition of this international side on the local that I think it doesn't help much. So probably all levels are good. All levels can bring something to these debates. But I think that the local is the first one. Then there is the regional. Then there is the national. And then there is the international. We cannot switch this because it generates conflicts. As I said, it's difficult to pretend internationally to understand something that is very local, because culture many times is very local, is based on tradition, is based on something that needs time to be understood.
Okay, thank you. Alain, Zoe, allez-y. Oui. Alain, allez-y.
Go ahead, Anna. Well, regarding my topic, I think it's very quickly, local dimension is very quickly present because there's a connection between the prud'hommes in France and in Spain as well. Same models, they do the same thing. But if you look at Italy, for instance, if you look at the corporatism, it comes from inside, within the community, where mindsets have been changing, and so it's the corporatism defending the profession itself that took over regarding local, as opposed to local economy protection. Okay, thank you.
L'emboîtement des échelles, je vais parler en français, l'emboîtement des échelles.
The different overlapping the scales, the meshing of the scales is really interesting. It's not always the Russian doll kind of thing where you can superimpose regional, local, regional. Sometimes the scales intermingle. Reconstructing the past also goes through the international aspect, the idea that the examples that Mr. Ligizi mentioned on Corsica is quite interesting. Also, the site that I mentioned in Diglitash, they've been working there for over 50 years, but the people in the local area, the site isn't open to the general public, to the locals. They can't go in and tour it. So what they see is like some trees, a natural lake where you used to go for your weekend walk or maybe get crawfish. And so now every Sunday they see all these researchers with resources coming in from the world over to come in and dig up this past. Well, they don't get it, as it were. So I do agree, but you have to help these people understand why it's important. First of all, to the locals, and then the rest of the world. But to them first. And so then I agree with you on that. You have to separate local out of it. It's really important. But sometimes by going via different scales. Alan, did you want to add something there? Go ahead. And it's true that if you talk about the fishing prud'hommes as small communities, if you talk about that on a European level, things get out of control. Things go awry because they don't know what's going on locally. The European commissioners got messed about by people who didn't want to understand what was going on there. Stefan, how about a final word? Well, Francois asked the question earlier. I almost reacted spontaneously, saying that, okay, yes, I'm working on micro-local. I'm working on people who are not necessarily involved in cultural heritage. But now when I think about that, I realize that that's not true, because the location I was talking about, the person who got me in touch with a historian who's a specialist in the regions, is very exciting, very interesting. So it's an economic stakeholder, not a researcher, not a cultural heritage specialist. He's working with research, reflection, and knowledge. So, of course, he's not a researcher, but he's using it. He's leveraging it. He's interested in it. And so this is included in his strategy as an economic actor, an economic stakeholder. That's one thing. Another point worth thinking about, I mentioned briefly, is that this is, he's local. And he was able to spotlight the local wine grape varieties. He's an economic actor. His father, when he created the conservatory in the 70s, and it was worthless back then in Corsica, but by taking this conservatory with these original grape varieties, the climate is favorable there, and so he was fortunate enough, and he had the economic intelligence to leverage an economic situation that was favorable to him. So the connection there between know-how, knowledge, researchers, and academia, they're very far removed from the local context. So including all of that in the local strategy, these are issues that seem very interesting for us as researchers, and people take ownership of that knowledge in the cultural heritage. Okay, I have the mic, so, okay, it is 5:30. I would like to thank all 5 of you for having shared your works, your research, and this will enable us to launch the discussion with the public, with the audience. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for contributing, and have a great evening and have a great rest of the symposium and this evening and tomorrow. So thank you all and see you soon.
Simplement un petit mot.
Just a brief, just wanted to let you know that there's going to be a snack and coffee in the Goguet area. So we invite you to come there in the Espace Goguet. Have a nice evening.